Imran. All right, and we're live. We're local. We're WAMU.
I'm gonna let you guys start. I'm gonna disappear for 5 seconds to get some water. But first of all, welcome everyone in the chat to the GSL. Richard will, going forward, be your host here. This is the new community channel where we will, where people from the community, especially people who organize it, will come on and we'll talk about stuff and we'll research things and so on. So make sure you like and subscribe, and we're going to be here pretty frequently, I think. So, yeah. I'll be right back. You guys take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to be going over this Substack article that's on the screen right now. We went over the introduction on Patreon, but if you weren't there, no worries. We're going to go over the beginning again, this time faster. We picked this article because it's related to some of the topics that we've been talking about on Sunday's channel, like sexual ethics, I guess some morality, Aristotle, Kant, gender. Yeah, and we think that this person is sincere in their efforts, and that means we're not going to be too mean because they're not a grifter or anything. But also, this article is not very good. Does anyone else have something to add?
Yeah, just that why we find the article interesting is because it identifies and works through a lot of, as mentioned, a lot of topics that we talk about, and gained a lot of popularity on Substack. And so we found this sort of, it's sort of like a cultural sampling that we're engaging with and trying to talk through and figure out better language for people to talk about.
Imran, do you have anything? I'm gonna guess no. Okay. Yeah.
I do think that a piece like this is a good something to bounce off of, right? Hit your tennis ball against the wall, so to speak. It's good to engage with stuff like this, because even if we don't agree with it, there's just a lot of good fertile ground for critique, I guess.
Oh, another thing I forgot to say is we should introduce ourselves. We're your moderators in the Cathedral Discord server. I'm Richard. To my left is August, then Imran, and then
Hello.
Shershot.
Hello, hi everybody. I've been quiet, but I was actually the one to bring up this article to Sunday when I first came across it on Substack, because I'm one of those people that frequents Substack because and it's a pretty interesting article. It's very fascinating in that you don't really come across, I would say, particularly rigorous attempts to deal with the subject. The article is titled, of course, I Lust, Therefore I Am, The Ethics of Desire. And this is like a very Substacky kind of title. And you'd expect, for example, someone to just have like maybe 10, 20 minutes of reading accompanying it. No, but this is really a built-out paper. In fact, I would even make the claim that what we're dealing with is closer to a paper than simply an article. And for that reason, I think it makes for a very interesting engagement, and probably the first engagement we're going to have on this channel. This is our christening engagement, everyone. Congratulations. But yeah, I mean, a couple things here. I think that this article is, you know what, here, I'll make an analogy. Oftentimes, there are conventions within the history of thought that don't really become explicit until the treatise comes out about it. So, for example, even though there have been notions of subject and object distinctions probably prior to any philosophers sitting down and trying to rationalize it out, the moment you have that is kind of the moment you get this kind of definitive thing you can finally take aim at from a sort of discursive perspective. So even if people in society have this notion that there are subjects and that there are objects, it is when that work comes out that finally the critique can really be levied, and these things can be re-examined in a critical way. And I would say that to relate this to what we're seeing with this article, the resurgence of a notion of lust, I think, has been an interesting thing to witness for especially people of my generation. So I'm 25 now, and so people 25 and younger, I think, are having this new re-engagement with an understanding of quote unquote lust, and there's a way in which the term has been kind of saved from just having a kind of theological lameness to it. I feel like when I was growing up talking about lust,
we shall see.
or has it? But I feel like when I was growing up, talking about lust was very like it's like what your parents did, or like a teacher or someone like this. It wasn't necessarily a thing that was talked about amongst ourselves. But now, on Substack, I'm seeing a lot of people my age who are actually treating this term very credulously, and treating it as if it has a content that's not simply, for example, like religious inheritance. And what's so interesting about this article, and what you'll see as a viewer, is that I guess we'll just call her Raz, because that's what she goes by on the internet. Raz is going to attempt to solidify or justify this notion, define and then justify this notion of lust on purely kind of secular philosophical grounds. So that's interesting. And I think this article is a sort of definitive statement we've been waiting for, that gives a kind of voice to what I think has been a brewing cultural inclination amongst interested and somewhat erudite young people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think with that we can get on to, we already covered the introduction in the previous stream. So I thought that we could do a quick recap of that and then start on section 1, which gets into definitions and the article in full force.
Sure. You want to lead us off?
Sure, yeah. So it opens with a discussion of what she's trying to do in the piece. You can see it up there on the top. That she's attempting to give a philosophical account, which we already went over. And that she believes that this is a substantive critique, but not just that this is an attempt to build a way of talking about the way that people engage with each other. So it's not a philosophy that's like quote unquote up in the air. It's not abstract. It's attempting to build out a piece that directly impacts the way that people live.
It's not metaphysical, in other words.
Well, metaphysics can do that, but sure, yes, it's not abstract. It's specific in how it is going to treat how we engage with each other and attempt to critique that on moral grounds, right?
Mhm.
And in the introduction, she honestly, a lot of this is covered later in the article, so I'm just going to highlight this section. I will begin from a simple observation, one that is more decisive than it first appears. There are individuals who do not watch pornography, do not cheat, do not sleep around, and do not have wandering eyes, and yet they seem to remain governed by lust. So this is one of the things that's going to build out the core way that this article is going to approach this topic of how we live our lives and what role lust plays in that, and the critique she is making. So for her, lust isn't necessarily specific sexual acts, specific actions, but a way of approaching thinking and desire. Going back to the title of the piece, The Ethics of Desire.
Later, she's going
Yeah,
to
I would-
define
well-
lust as the
Hmm.
as a type of perception that objectifies people in a very Kantian way.
Yeah, it's a way of engaging with other people.
No, I think so. I think so. But I will say that, well, what's interesting about it is that it's a way of engaging with other people that doesn't start at the point of engagement. And that's what's so interesting about it. So all the external stuff that we tend to deal with when we talk about the ethical, how we treat others in the most immediate, consequential way, this is going to be considered behaviors for Raz, from what I've seen. And this is going to be vis-a-vis, meaning on the other side of something like an internal inclination, a kind of disposition. Might be a way of thinking about it as well. Some kind of, or actually the phrase that she deploys here is inner life. So we're going to have a notion of something like an inner life that is almost, I guess, dualistically necessarily opposed to external behaviors, and that this inner life, and that really what Raz is interested in, is the organization of this inner life. And she has an idea of one passing into the other. Which, by the way, is an old philosophical move that has very interesting problems. I want to point out that one of the oldest examples of a dualism like this is something between soul and body in Descartes. And why I'm bringing this up is because, and funnily enough, it's actually a princess who we don't tend to remember within the history of philosophy who problematizes this sort of a thing. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because what this princess points out, who is Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, what she points out is when you have such an exceptional dualism between these two contents, how you get from one to the other becomes an issue. How do you get from, for example, immaterial soul to material body stuff? What is
right?
So I like to call these transformation problems. I'm kind of borrowing this from economics, but I think it works here, where it's a problem of precisely how you transform from one state into the other if they are of distinct substances, for example. And so here we're seeing a dualism, and I am interested to see how Raz is going to try to make the transference from something like inner life or some kind of internal, non-physical, non-extended life somehow into the extended of behaviors and this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been going on for a while, so we should get started with the reading itself.
Yeah.
You want to start, Imran?
I can start us off.
And before you guys get started, I just want to say thank you guys for putting this on. And again, for people in the audience, we are going to be landing here pretty frequently after stream on Present Sunday Prime. So make sure you subscribe. I will be here every so often. Ambrose will be here every so often. I'm hoping that Brooks and so on, other people will be here every so often. This is basically the community site. So whereas Present Sunday Prime is my channel and where I run things, I do not run things here. This is where the people who run the community side of things talk and make content and so on. And I would like to get it monetized because at a certain point I would like the people who run it to see some kind of return on that. But yeah, so if you haven't subscribed already and you haven't hit the notification bell, make sure you do that. And I'm going to let them have the stage for now. But once again, thank you, Richard, for hosting this, and thanks, guys, for all the prep work and everything you're doing tonight. Okay.
Thank you, Sunday.
Good to see you.
Godspeed.
Oh, I do want to add one quick thing, which is that Sunday, in the way he described the GSL, completely true. Although I do want to add on that we are still like a community. So don't be. I don't want people to have the idea that we're some massive library or something like this. You can come in and have regular kind of engagements, talk about stuff happening in the world, in your life, stuff that you want to share. For example, we have a wholesomeness channel where people just get to send like pets and other kinds of things like this, right? And we might even start having community nights and other such things. Who knows? But all that and more at the GSL. And with that being said, I'm going to get started with the article. For those who are just joining, this article is titled "I Lust, Therefore I Am," subtitle "The Ethics of Desire," subheading "A Philosophy of Sexual Discipline, Loyalty, and the Self," published by the user named Raz on her letter, Raz's Revelations. Okay. Most people believe lust is obvious. They imagine it as the consumption of pornography, infidelity, exploitation, wandering eyes, something which is external and measurable. They conclude that by the absence of these indulgences, lust must also be absent. However, I find reason to doubt this, for it seems to me that many mistake the outward appearance of discipline for discipline itself, and that they confuse restraint of a physical act with a governance of internal appetite. Can I
Imran,
comment on this really quickly? Yeah.
I think since we had already covered the introduction last stream, we were going to go on to section 1.
I think we should
sorry,
read
stipulating
section 1.
definitions.
We can read this section really quickly without any commentary.
Okay.
Okay, sure. Yeah, we'll just get a recap. Okay. Continuing on. So, I will begin from a simple observation, one that is more decisive than it first appears. There are individuals who do not watch pornography, do not cheat, do not sleep around, and do not have wandering eyes, and yet they seem to remain governed by lust. Their hands are clean, but their mind is impure. They behave in the narrow sense, yet their gaze scans and their mind rehearses. Publicly, they are perceived by others as faithful and virtuous, while privately maintaining their indulgence. Such a person likely believes himself to be disciplined, but I argue he is still ruled, only more quietly. And it is this quiet rule, this inward governance by appetite, that I take to be the deeper problem. For if lust were only an external act, it would be sufficient to prohibit the act alone. But lust is not merely something one does. It is a way of seeing and feeling an ordering of the soul that conditions one to interpret objects as consumables. And this is why modern conversations surrounding sexuality so often miss the point. What is entertained in the mind is not inert. What you repeatedly indulge internally becomes what you are most prepared to enact outwardly when conditions weaken. And even when it never becomes outward, it still exacts a cost, eroding the integrity of the self and corroding the possibility of love. The consequences are not confined to abstract ethics. They appear first where life becomes most personal, in relationships. Society expects fidelity while rehearsing dispersion. Individuals call themselves loyal while allowing their attention to wander. They label boundaries as controlling whenever they inconvenience appetite, and they pathologize jealousy. Many discover too late that loyalty is not a switch that can be turned on by romance. It is a principle formed long before romance arrives. And thus relationships devolve into a system of women and men essentially cucking each other, all claiming freedom but never achieving true intimacy. There are also more visible symptoms that we treat as harmless preference while ignoring what it truly reveals. An escalating war against the human body. Men and women increasingly carve themselves to resemble exaggerated forms and pursue grotesque ideals of appearance. Both become dissatisfied with the ordinary because the ordinary no longer stimulates. And the predictable result is a population that mutilates itself to cling closer to the standard. Brazilian butt lifts, fillers, nose jobs, implants, sculpting. And on the other end of the spectrum, bone smashing, invasive jaw surgeries, and the abuse of steroids and peptides outside of medical supervision. The body and self become projects, not for health or flourishing, but for marketability within a sexualized economy. Even speech degrades. Comment sections are filled with sexual reduction. Creators become surfaces for projection, an outlet for sexual degeneracy. In real life, men engage with vulgar vocabulary. Look at that rack. She's an 8.5 at best. Would crack. and so casually, even while in a relationship. Women do analogous things, commenting on bulges, height, muscles, celebrity crushes, also while in a relationship. The point attempting to be demonstrated here is not that one sex is uniquely guilty, but that lust plagues our society. It has conditioned people into a style of perception that treats human beings as consumables, and then we act surprised when loyalty weakens, devotion becomes rare, and degeneracy is rampant. We've become consumed by it without an ounce of regulation. And, worst of all, to call people toward temperance, towards restraint, loyalty, and self-governance, you're prudish, an extremist, or an apologist for purity culture. As if refusing to be ruled by such impulse is a pathology rather than a virtue. What prompted me to write this article was an epiphany that felt less like an idea and more like a bodily reaction. Lust evoked in me a visceral revolt, and from this intuition followed reasoning and conclusions. Thus, I felt compelled to share the depravity that lust produces when normalized, so that you may understand the importance of temperance, learn to restrain yourself, and look for cues in others, lest you end up with someone with a disloyal heart and a lack of respect for you. To proceed without confusion, I will do a few things. First, I will define my terms precisely, especially the distinctions between attraction, sexual desire, lust, and love. Second, I will draw on Aristotle, Kant, Isaiah Berlin, and other philosophical concepts to establish a framework for relations and self-governance. Finally, I will articulate my view, where I will argue that sexual discipline must extend beyond behavior into inner life. Before moving forward, I ask only that the reader enter this in good faith and with an open mind. I find that lust is a subject people typically take personally. A critique of it is often interpreted as an attack against the individual, and that is not my intention. The aim is not to degrade people for ignorance, but to articulate an ethical framework I attempt to apply in my own life, and to argue why it is worth applying to your own. If any part of what I write seems unclear or too severe, I would suggest rereading the text before rejecting it. Many confusions often dissolve upon a second pass, once the distinctions and definitions are held steadily in mind. And if confusion persists, I encourage a third pass. And if even then confusion remains, I encourage inquiry, not dismissal, because this is the embodiment of intellectual fairness, and this is precisely the kind of subject that benefits from honest engagement. Quote, "For it is not enough to have a good mind. The main thing is to apply it well. The greatest souls are capable of the greatest vices, as well as the greatest virtues. And those who proceed only very slowly can make such greater progress, provided they always follow the right path, than do those who hurry and stray from it." End quote. Descartes. Okay, that was the introduction. How do we want to proceed with section 1, family?
I think we can just go ahead, read the first paragraph, and there will be plenty to say, I think, already.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can read the first paragraph.
Okay, wonderful.
Sure.
Section 1, stipulating definitions. Before framing my view, it is important that I first establish definitions for the terms I will be using. Firstly, it should be clear that the use of the term lust in this article is not identical with sexual desire. Colloquially, lust is used interchangeably and as a synonym for desire, but such usage overlooks an important moral distinction. Sexual desire, in and of itself, is not inherently evil, just as money in itself is not evil, but greed, which results in the excessive lust for wealth and perpetual pursuit of it. What is morally objectionable is not the mere presence of desire, but the deformation of desire into excess and use. It is what we call greed in relation to wealth, gluttony in relation to food, and lust in relation to sexuality.
Yeah, I mean, even here, so you'll notice her description of lust is based around this idea of overconsumption or overindulgence, which does not necessarily fit with at least all traditional or religious notions of lust, where lust was a notion of sort of desire not within the law, right? It's lust unless you're married, then it's like a canonized, allowed thing to have, right? You can't have sex outside of marriage. You can't desire someone who's not yours. This is more of a legal or legal in a broad sense of like religious law as well notion. But here, she's specifically defining it as deformation into excess. And so that'll be important for as we go on.
Yes, I agree with you. What's fascinating here to add on to this is that, of course, her point is that the process itself of sexual desire doesn't in itself license a moral claim. And she's going to get into that more. What's interesting, of course, though, is that excess doesn't necessarily license a moral claim either, insofar as it's going to be defined upon descriptive terms. And that's something we're also going to see, and something to also keep in mind. One kind of leitmotif we're going to have in this article is the very uncertain marriage of, let's say, evolutionary or just generally biological arguments and purposeful sort of Aristotelian / maybe even Abrahamic prescriptions about purpose and these other sorts of things. And it's going to be a very interesting kind of uncertain, hesitant, unsteady kind of relation between these distinct things, conceptually speaking.
Yes, the telos raises its ugly head once again.
It will, and we'll definitely see that. So, you want to pick this up, Sure Shot, or do you want someone else to go?
I can. Go ahead.
I can do the next one.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay, I'll do it, and then I'll head over to August after that.
Sounds good.
From a biological standpoint, sex can be understood fundamentally as something which serves as a means of reproduction, its primary function. However, it is quite reductive and disingenuous to pretend this exhausts the meaning of sex, especially within the context of humans. Human sexuality is far more complex, bound up with pleasure, pair bonding, and emotional connection, all of which are functions of sex that can extend beyond the purpose of conceiving offspring. Though within evolutionary biology, they are understood to have developed for the purpose of providing motivation for sex, thereby facilitating reproduction. This is a concept within the philosophy of biology, where reproduction can be understood as an effect explanation for why sex exists, whereas pleasure and bonding can function as casual roles, extended functions
Causal
that
roles.
help explain their role within human social dynamics. Sorry, what?
Causal roles. Not casual roles.
Yeah, function. Oh, I said casual. Sorry. Function is causal roles, extended functions that help explain their role within human social dynamics. I will not expound further on the biology to avoid tangenting here, as the point is not to write a biology article, but to establish a foundation. We possess sexual features and behaviors that are the result of expiation and evolutionary byproducts, and thus, sex has purposes beyond procreation.
One thing that I noticed
so-
here is that
Yeah.
the purposes of sex that she points out beyond reproduction are pleasure, pair bonding, and emotional connection, all of which are like wholesome, traditional, wholesome.
Well, I would specifically
purposes of
highlight
sex.
here that pleasure, pair bonding, and emotional.
And
Sorry, I
emotional
didn't mean to
connection
interrupt you there.
are all the same thing, you were going to say?
Partially, but also that she's talking about it in the way you would imagine a biologist talking about a non-human species to discuss it, right? These are very biological terms. That
kind of
that are
evo psych, kind of,
yes.
yeah.
And so here, claiming human sexuality is far more complex, but relying on a sort of much more basic biological notion of what sex is for, I think stands out.
Mm-hmm. What I was going to say is that she's
Agreed.
missing
Also,
the economic purpose of sex. and
Right.
sexuality.
And also that it takes place within a social context, because she's only talking about pair bonding and emotional connection as a thing between individuals, not as in a thing that takes place within a larger society and social
Yeah.
dynamics.
That
Which is funny
structures
because
society.
she did mention earlier the quote unquote sexual marketplace.
Mm-hmm. Oh, she said sexualized economy.
Yeah.
Which means that like everything needs to be sold.
Yeah, I think
through
it's telling
sexuality.
that. I find it telling that she uses the adjective instead of the noun. I think that's kind of telling in the way that she thinks of it. Where it's that the marketplace, this quote unquote sexualized marketplace, is an intrusion on her idea of what sexuality is and not an extension of it.
Yes. Okay. I think that's a really good
Perhaps.
point. I think one of the things you're going to see with this article is that it's going to try to maintain a kind of an idea of the natural that is being defected from. And for those of us here who have been kind of watching Sunday a lot recently, he's been reading a book called The Politics of Nature by Bruno Latour, which tries to explicitly problematize the underlying dualism of nature and culture, upon which we can even establish some notion of a kind of natural state of things that is defected from by certain cultural impositions that might be unsavory to, for example, Raz in this case. So that's already something to keep in mind as well for those who are tuned into that discourse. I also wanted to point out, but that's a good point, Sure Shot. And actually, to add on to that, this move from the sexual to the sexualized that Raz makes is also, points out that it's also something about ornamentation. It's also something about excess, doing too much, moving away from the default. Within Abrahamic thinking, whether it's, say, for example, Christian or Islamic or whatever else, we gain this idea of a kind of default, basic, original state that is given to us, that is only then superposed by, for example, forms of cultural ornamentation. So building up upon the body, for example, with modifications and this whole thing. This is oftentimes haram or just a general sin in Christianity. Sorry,
Right.
August?
Oh yeah, I was going to say there's this notion of like God's intended way of life that he built the human for, right? When you're viewing it through this lens of there being a purpose behind certain attributes, you then associate certain things like the identification of a mean or like an average way of doing things as a sort of correct in and of itself, based
Proper,
upon it
yeah.
being average.
Yes, totally. Absolutely.
Yeah, and in this case, we're locating instead of locating the telos within God, we're locating it within biology.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah.
And by the way, so this is actually a really interesting thing, because for example, from either an antiquated standpoint, in other words, in the standpoint of, say, for example, the classical world, or from a standpoint that is Abrahamic or moving away from the Abrahamic, we have the conjunction, we have the complete combination, or the fusion, the union of the descriptive and prescriptive. In other words, there is no gap or separation between the way in which one ought to live and the way in which one naturally lives, insofar as they're both provided by a deity in conjunction. And of course, treating nature from a secular standpoint, trying to do so from a secular standpoint, now implies a gulf, a distinction of this kind of descriptive and prescriptive, where one no longer implies the other per se, and you have to figure out how to involve the prescriptive in the world of just facts and events and things that seem to happen. And so you're also going to see a situation where Raz, basically taking that kind of, let's say, amoral aspect of nature, of just things that happen, will try to come back and impose certain moral claims upon it, make moral claims come to bear upon it, And this is also going to be another kind of uncertain liaison between two things that are not necessarily no longer intertwined within a, for example, religious cosmology.
Do you guys think we can move on to the next one?
Yeah.
Mhm.
August, you
you'd
should
like
pick this one
to-
up.
Yeah.
Sure. Therefore, sexual desire can be understood as something that plays a causal role, motivating individuals towards intercourse, often influenced by biology, even when not consciously so. Hence, I can conclude that sexual desire is not automatically immoral, as biology does not make prescriptive claims, but merely descriptive ones. However, the fact that desire can be expressed beyond reproduction introduces a moral dilemma, making it vulnerable to excess and indulgence. And this is where lust appears. So here again, so she's claiming that biology does not make prescriptive claims, while relying on biology for a prescriptive idea of what is the proper placement of desire, which she's locating in this evolutionary psychology notion, right?
Oh yeah, agreed. And so excess is going to become the hinge for all this, or maybe let's say the site of the meeting between the two that I think she's going to orchestrate. So it'll be from a notion of excess that is descriptively observable, which is already problematic, to be clear,
Right.
because you have to ask an excess of what and precisely why that even matters. But it'll be the site where we can somehow descriptively observe some kind of excessive usage or some kind of excessive engagement in an activity. And therefore, from this, she's going to try to bring in at this point something like moral claims. So something
Right.
about good, bad. Later, she's going to get.
Brooks
She's
had
going to
a
use the
comment
example
in
of being.
chat here.
Yeah.
Be
What's
careful
up?
not presuming through the though the idea that Latour is treating the natural way as the thing to counter is really countering the idea of an objective. Yes, precisely.
Yeah, of course. No. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Sure. Yeah.
It's in the
I mean-
telos in the idea of there being a right or wrong way based upon some presupposed first thing or thing that decides what is or isn't in its proper place.
Right. And it seems to me that what that ends up doing is mirroring a very conventional, kind of a very old discourse. Right. So, for
It's
example,
almost like eating of the apple of the tree of knowledge, sort of thing, where it's like as soon as something becomes cultural, it's like this separate register where morality begins to enter, whereas before there was none.
Precisely. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's exactly it.
I think so. Yeah, we're in a fallen situation, right? No, but I mean, to quickly on Brooks's point, I don't want to belabor this too much because we're doing an article, but yes, because I agree, and I want to say on that when it comes to not treating things, dealing with the objective, maybe is how I'll put it. When it comes to that, like, I do want to say that this is a very conventional thing in the history of philosophy, right? An appeal to, say, for example, a state of nature as a way to justify certain cultural practices. And fun fact, you also get this within certain environmental movements, where they still have this notion of a nature that has been defected from, or at least that's being regulated badly, that's being dealt with maybe in a way that's impermissible. And therefore, we must realign ourselves alongside this state that is somehow, again, before, outside of us, that we must also, and sometimes even within us at the same time. Sonny made a wonderful point where he said sometimes we conceive of nature as also the outside that is within us at the same time. So our own natures, our own naturality, which is what Raz is talking about, right? For Raz, it's also going to be this kind of outside that is within us that we need to align ourselves towards, and that she is going to produce an entire framework that is going to help us achieve this on the basis of sexuality, or at least on the subject of sexuality. Anyway, yeah, that's all I wanted to say about this.
Shall we continue on?
Oh yeah, I had one more thing to say.
Yeah, okay.
She says, The fact that desire can be expressed beyond reproduction introduces a moral dilemma, which means that even if there was no lust, the fact that that sexuality has to do with pair bonding and like emotional connection, that already introduces a moral problem, which I think is a mistake.
Right. It's exactly this sort of nature culture distinction that allows there to be a sort of a morality of all these things, right? That there, as Sure Shot was pointing out, the fact that there's this idea of like a we're now outside of nature as moral agents, and so now we have to morally contend with the conditions of desire.
Right.
Which, by the way,
but she had already identified
Yeah.
conditions in her supposed explanation of nature, which would contradict that.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think that's right, August. I mean, insofar as she's talking about excess and these sorts of things, we're not just being given the descriptive quad the descriptive. And for viewers, what I mean by that is we're not simply just being given descriptive actualities. For example, we're not just being given quantities of something. We're being given value judgments, a posterior reflection upon the descriptive. So already we have prescriptions that are working themselves into how the descriptive is being explained here. When we have a notion of something like excess, for example. I mean, just to maybe be more pointed about this, I hate to use this guy because he really sucks, but he actually, he's very clarifying on this. John Searle will point out that even insofar as we talk about a good heart and a bad heart, this has to be given by a subjective judgment that has its own assembly of ends, right? Its own assembly of goals and ends and this sort of a thing. What a good heart and a bad heart is not what Searle will call observer independent. It's not something that obtains without agents there to impose precisely what those values mean. And so there, right, you see a situation where the prescriptive is given or is superposed upon the descriptive. We no longer just simply have a descriptive state. We no longer have, say, for example, an EKG reading. We have a value that is being referenced within that descriptive explanation: good heart, bad heart, failing heart, etc. And so that's also something to think about, because beyond Raz, this is something you're going to see with a lot of different people. I mean, we tend to think this way. We tend to really imbue our own value systems and then presume that we're only dealing with things at a level of description when we've already fused in very, very many goals and ends and ideas and purposes and so on and so forth. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we'll get to a lot of that as we continue on as well.
Yeah, totally.
Next paragraph.
Yes.
I guess I'll just read it.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Lust is often conflated with sexual desire for the reason being that our lust for sexual gratification is one of the strongest appetites we have, capable of ruling so strongly over rational deliberation. But lust, as mentioned previously, is not limited to this. Considering the polysemy of this word, I will adhere to a broad definition for this article. Lust is the excessive longing for something that becomes consuming, such that the desire is no longer governed by reason or voluntary choice, and begins to treat its object as a means to gratification. This language kind of sounds like addiction. It is instrumentality, the orientation towards use. And specifically in the context of persons, lustful sexual desire necessarily reduces persons to objects.
So there's two things going on here. First, there's lust as access, and second, lust as objectification.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's going to be crucial to remember.
It raises
and
the
in fact,
question.
of course.
of whether
Yeah.
something that is objectification but isn't excessive, or something that is excessive but isn't objectifying, whether those things are lustful or whether that's something else.
I would say that, and I think it's going to bear on the article, I would say that Raz is going to attempt to make that impossible. I think Raz is going to attempt to make it impossible to suggest that you have a situation of excessive, say for example, sexual desire that doesn't become lustful, or a situation of lustful sexual desire that isn't precisely sexual desire in excess. And
Yeah,
and
so
we
excess
can
is
we can contend
precisely
with this, of course, but
the-
yeah.
Excess, the way that she's talking about, is precisely the misbalancing between sexual desire and voluntary choice, where sexual desire in some way, as she's thinking about it, overtakes voluntary choice. So there's not really a way that it could be in excess but not be lust, for the way that she's talking about it.
Agreed.
I just wanted to note that she's taking this, and we'll expand on it later, but this is based around a Kantian idea that is sort of being put towards like a feminist understanding of something like objectification, right? So Kant talks about this idea of treating people as means towards an end for yourself, right? There's a gratification of an end that is personal to you, and therefore does not take into account the other person, right? That's the thing that she's drawing from.
Yeah, I actually have nothing to add to that at the moment, I don't think. Yeah, that was good. Agreed.
And it's going to be important to note how she goes about defining these terms, right? Because I think that there's a small piece of that many of us would not find great objection to. It's going to be how she goes about understanding what this is and what it looks like, and what the role of quote unquote voluntary choice is in this process.
I also think what's really interesting about this is this sharp division between desire and reason, as if the two are not intimate and one intimately contingent, and one can actually override the other.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And actually, this is a very
thing earlier with the necessity of there being this dualism of desire and reason, with this reasoning voluntary person at the center, and yet somehow they're also operating on the same plane to where they can interact with each other.
Yeah, it's like they have it's almost like they have different origins, and then they meet somewhere on this plane, this ethical plane that she's operating in.
Yeah, I would say that dualisms always have a kind of strong and weak term to them, and not to get too theoretical. But we see this, for example, with things like being and appearance, where being is really the kind of more default term, and appearance becomes contingent upon being. Something has to be in order to appear, but something may not appear in order to be, etc. Within classical philosophy, within feminist philosophy, we see that people like Lucy Irigaray, for example, have pointed out that the relationship between man and woman have a similar situation, wherein the woman has a kind of specular, kind of mirroring relation for the default male subject within the history of how we tend to think. You even see this with the conscious and unconscious in Freud, where conscious life is the more usual, grounded, dominant term that the unconscious can only kind of interrupt and interject in, for example. And here I would say that the dualism being posed has a similar situation wherein reason will be the thing that is more fundamental, and desire is going to be that which always comes from the outside to possibly corrode it, to set it astray, to engage in what she would call a disintegration somehow, which has issues, but it's going to be the same kind of relation, I think, finally.
Yeah. Shall I read the next little bit?
Yeah, can you read this is going to be important for the viewer, the clarification about voluntary choice that she's taken from Aristotle.
Yes. To clarify, I am using voluntary choice here in a more demanding sense than mere outward consent or momentary decision. I mean something closer to what Aristotle treats as choice. Excuse my Greek. Proheresis, and Isaiah Berlin's distinction in liberty. I will develop this more explicitly in the next section when I draw on these philosophers to establish what it means for desire to be internally governed.
Okay, we don't have to say anything about that at the moment.
Yeah,
you want me to
I
pick up
think
from here?
I can do another paragraph or two, and then you can pick up.
Okay, sounds good.
To clarify what is meant by use in this context, I do not mean any interaction in which one person benefits from another is therefore use and immoral. Human beings inevitably gain from their relations with one another. Mutual benefit is not an issue. The distinction here is personhood, whether usefulness exhausts what an individual is. And this gets back to what we were just talking about with the sort of Kantian distinction, because as she is right to clarify, if you were to regard any interaction in which you benefit as use, you would have no interactions left. That would be ridiculous. But it's actually this distinction of personhood or agency, which, as we saw in the discussion of Latour, is going to be a very important and I mean, it's sort of the grounds of the political is often around this question of personhood, who is treated as an interlocutor, an equal versus an object to be acted upon, a nature to be responded to, a nature to be ruled over, etc.
Yes, quite right. And in fact, I think it's good for the viewers to understand that this kind of Kantian framework of personhood vis-a-vis objecthood, this isn't necessarily, an innovation by Raz to use this discourse. This discourse has been a thing in I think in certain, like, especially like feminist readings for a while now. For example, Irigaray will start thinking about subject and object, but even that's already too strange. I mean, the idea of regarding the personhood of someone and therefore treating them as an end rather than a means. This is a very kind of conventional, usual way to go about it. And so it's very interesting that Raz is going to use this, because what we're going to see here is that she's going to load in her own entailments for when, for example, someone is treated like an object vis-a-vis a person. And so I would say that this is actually a very normal way of going about it. What's going to be really interesting and somewhat eccentric is how Raz is going to define when either thing has happened, when someone's been treated as an end vis-a-vis when someone's been treated as a means. Yeah.
You want to go on to the next paragraph?
Sure. To treat someone as a person is to regard them as a subject, an agent with ends, reasons, and interiority that impose constraints on how you may relate to them. It is to relate to them under a description that preserves morally authoritative features. Things such as consent are essential because they communicate agency, and well-being demonstrates that persons have ends. They are subjects which may flourish. To treat someone as a mere means, however, is to treat their personhood as irrelevant. Consent is something which can be revoked or managed. Their good and well-being becomes a second variable, and their value is reduced to the function they serve for your gratification. It is to relate to them under a description in which those features are no longer decisive. Okay, I think I'll say something about this. I wanted to give a pause. Oh yeah, Richard.
I was asking if we should go on.
Oh yeah.
Or if you'd like me to read the next
I think I want to say.
one.
Oh, I can read the one after this. I think I feel like there's something I want to say about this paragraph in particular. So I already brought up earlier that what's going to be interesting here is what it means to treat someone as a mere means vis-a-vis an end for Raz. But I think alongside this, I think also it's interesting that part of that is that consent is not going to be enough, and that already here you see a situation wherein addressing is not enough. Addressing is not enough. What do I mean by addressal? I'm going to borrow a little bit from a very interesting kind of early 20th century philosopher named I'm actually forgetting his name. He did the the Ich bin du reading, which is precisely which is precisely sorry, excuse me, which is precisely sorry, I'm being solicited for something. Excuse me on that. Anyway, so Martin Buber is his name, and he has this book called I Thou, which is something like Ich du or something like this in German. And his point is that the way we relate to subjects is different from how we relate to objects. And so he's taking this notion of a subject-object distinction, and he's trying to delineate how we treat these things by basically producing this notion of addressal. So for Buber, it's something like, I don't actually have to address the objects that I use. For example, if I'm going to utilize, or let's say deal with a toothbrush, not just use it, but deal with a toothbrush maybe, I don't actually have to address it. I don't have to get anything like a consent from the toothbrush. I don't have to, in a sense, value what a toothbrush would think about anything. I can just use it. And so he calls this a kind of I-it relation, the relation one has with the world of objects around them. Now he contrasts this with something like an I-thou relation, thou being that which is being addressed by the I. So, in other words, there's something about you that cannot be apprehended in the same way that I can simply apprehend a toothbrush. And therefore, your subjectivity, which is precisely that I can't hold in my hand, I can't deal with it tangibly, I must address it, I must solicit it, I must tarry with it. And therefore, in this process of me having to, in a sense, tarry, deal with, address you, I am recognizing your subjectivity, establishing something like an I-thou relation. And so this is, key for, because consent, of course, is within the dimension of addressal. In order to ascertain or attain the assent or consent or whatever of another subject, you have to engage them as a subject, right? And that's where that comes out of it. For Raz, this is not enough. For Raz, you can have a situation where you are addressing someone and dealing with their subjectivity, and at the same time somehow still objectifying them. And so I think this is going to be very interesting, and it's going to require a lot of evidence and sharp thinking to be able to, I think, to build this out. Yeah, sorry if that was a little bit wordy, and I got a little interrupted there, but that's kind of the point I wanted to make.
Richard, did you want to read a section?
I'll read the paragraph after this next one, which Imran wants to read.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm reading this paragraph?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to expound on this more formally.
Okay, cool. Awesome. To expound on this more formally, some things have instrumental value. That is, they are valuable because they serve a further end. Other things have intrinsic value. That is, they are valuable in themselves. The core feature of instrumental value is replaceability. If the tool fails, another will do, because what is meaningful is the function. The mark of intrinsic value, on the other hand, is non-fungibility. An object with intrinsic value is not merely a unit in the system, but something whose worth is not reducible to its utility. Most people agree intuitively that persons belong to this latter category. All persons have intrinsic value, and to recognize this feature is to acknowledge they are not the kind of thing whose significance can be captured by their function. By the way, I just want to point out, there's going to be a way in which the sexual is given special significance in this, right? So for example, if you hire a guy to do a job, you are quite literally using them as a functional means to an end, which opens them up to interchangeability. Now, to be clear, you can critique this. There's certain anti-capitalists that have critiqued this way of going about it, of forming, let's say, an economy of things and persons, precisely on this basis.
Imran, your mic got a little more distant sounding.
Oops, sorry. Hello, am I good? Hello.
Yes,
Much better. Okay.
Now you're better. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I wanted to say that there's going to be something like a special significance being accorded to a sexual activity vis-a-vis other activities that we do with people in the world that we seem to consider permissible. So, for example, the question here would be, why, for example, does it seem fine to deal with people as means for some greater, let's say, for example, communal or business or otherwise survival end, but in other cases, but not with the case of, say, for example, sexual pleasure? That's going to be something that I think will have to be like, what keeps us from having this kind of
This is
relationship? But
yeah,
but
this is
also,
a very. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
well, to button up, what allows us to have this for the sexual, but not have it for example, something like labor or work or play or anything else that we might be fine having this kind of relationship within
Kind of
conventional life.
transactional versus.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually part of what makes the article interesting, not necessarily just in its content, but in the sort of structural position it has, that it is addressing this issue specifically, speaks to a sort of configuration and arrangement of social discussions and political contestations that are taking place, right? It's a site of social political action that this piece is going to focus on something like sexuality, right? It's not some sort of neutral choice. It's specific discourse with political, social, etc. ramifications.
Yeah, well, I was going to make that explicit by just going directly to the pretty imminent fight within feminism, I guess, between people who are okay with sex work and people who aren't, right? So it's like, okay, why on the one hand are we okay with hiring somebody and using their body, in a sense, their physical labor, to do work as, say, an Amazon employee in a warehouse, but we're not okay with it in the context of sex work, right?
Right. And there ends up being sort of a particular question too of like what it means to be okay with it. Like you can have people who, for example, criticize the relations of labor in the abstract, but then use specifically very moralistic language when it comes to something like sex work, despite it carrying a lot of the same features that are being rallied against in common with the rest of alienated labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll
Shall we
keep reading.
continue on? Yeah.
Hence, this is what it means to strip an individual of personhood. It's not that you are metaphysically erasing their humanity, but that you deny the very features that make them a subject rather than an object. A being with intrinsic value cannot be treated as a mere instrument, because instruments are exhausted by their function or highest ordered use, whereas persons possess ends and interiority that place moral constraints on how they may be engaged with. Thus, if lust, as we have defined it, is something which consumes and treats objects as a means to an end, and by extension of this it necessarily reduces individuals of personhood, then lust can be regarded as something inherently immoral. Okay. I think we've sort of addressed these points, so I can go on.
Yep, precisely.
Mhm.
Yeah, go ahead.
Furthermore, lust is something which is consumed beyond what is natural. Take, for example, the excess consumption of food, which causes the stomach to stretch beyond its natural shape to accommodate, or the excess of sleep, which results in cognitive deficits and health issues. It is clear that the body has a natural limit, providing clear indicators of too much. The stomach possesses mechanoreceptors which, when the walls expand, propagate nerve signals to the central nervous system, triggering the release of specialized hormones, prompting us to stop eating and regulating appetite around a mean that protects survival. Likewise, sleep is regulated through circadian rhythms and homeostasis. But unlike our sleep and food, sexual desire is not governed by the same CAP signals or modulatory systems, because it is not primarily a survival state, but a motivated state, capable of indefinite escalation when repeatedly rewarded. I would definitely not
There's a lot
say
going on
that.
there.
Yeah.
First of all, the big glaring thing to me is how is it that the cause of your gluttony is not the result of the same biomechanical processes that are also responsible for this so-called limit.
Right. Precisely. There, it releases. It's again that sort of teleological understanding that's putting a telos to, not just to evolution writ large, but to a specific understanding of what the proper amount is, attempting to fall back on something like evolution when they're really, like you were saying,
It's kind of ascribing a purpose to homeostasis rather than a competition between varying drives within an organism achieving
Yes.
some kind of balance. Right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd also say that sexuality is far from the only stimulus that we can get too much of, and we also don't have a regulatory system for. Like, this is the reason that we can get accidentally poisoned with carbon monoxide, or when people like sit in the garage and keep the engine running, that they don't feel that they're suffocating because we don't have like carbon dioxide detectors.
I mean, it seems fairly obvious to me that like we don't like have sex or seek sex indefinitely. There are limits on there are literal physical and biochemical limits on that as well.
Gingros, I think
Sorry, I mean, this
your
is totally
comment
right.
is only true if you view all other forms of labor as sexual assault.
Which, you know what? There is a way you can do that. There is a way, if you
Yeah,
want to
if
go
you're
that
really
there is a way.
frank, yeah, you can go that direction.
If you're really frank. Sorry, I want to point out something in this paragraph. You're all saying very true and wonderful things. I wholly agree. Another interesting thing here, and I think the audience should be party to this because this is a very important thing when we talk about the the kind of human relative aspect of assigning things like functions or saying things are in excess. Why this is important is because, for example, when it comes time to, excuse me one second, my cat is invading. Get away from me. Sorry. When it comes time to, I'm not actually that mean to him. When it comes time to actually deal with these things, we want to avoid conflations, right? When it's time to give the fact of the matter, we don't want to also give the value of the matter to us. This is just good intellectual quote unquote hygiene. It's just kind of a best practices sort of a thing. And so even when we see something like, for example, within this paragraph, when Raz writes indicators of too much, what does that mean? Too much is a value judgment. It's not at all within the actual fact of the matter. There is no too much indicator. There are
Right.
indications that. Sorry, were you gonna say something?
Oh no, I think it goes back to what Shershot was saying, that it's the thing that we're claiming after the fact, after there's been a confluence of forces taking place within an organism. And so you can even have a situation where, for example, an organism is not getting enough nutrients for survival, and yet at the same time have indicators of too much, but it's only in this, that she is placing the label of too much on, because it doesn't actually mean too much. It's just a network of connections that have exert a force within the organism, right?
No, absolutely. And actually, I have a little excerpt here from The Construction of Social Reality by John Searle, which I think really gets at this distinction very well. I'm going to read this very quickly. It's not very long. It's about a paragraph length.
Okay.
But Searle wants to make this point, and I think this will really hammer this in for the viewers. Searle wants to make this point about how values come in through the usage of things like function. So he says, uh, it is, for example, sorry. here we go. We are blinded to this fact by the practice, especially in biology, of talking of functions as if they were intrinsic to nature. By the way, you see how this is going to be very important to everyone because we tend to conflate these things. I have friends who build things for a living. They're engineers, and they think functions are simply a part of nature. This is a very intuitive way of going about it, and I think this needs to be cleaved before we go on with this article. We need to get rid of this horrible conflation. So basically, Searle will write. We are blinded to this by the fact that by the practice, especially in biology, of talking of functions as if they were intrinsic to nature. But except for those parts of nature that are conscious, nature knows nothing of functions. It is, for example, intrinsic to nature that the heart pumps blood and causes it to course through the body. It is also an intrinsic fact of nature that the movement of the blood is related to a whole lot of other causal processes having to do with the survival of the organism. But when, in addition to saying the heart pumps blood, we say the function of the heart is to pump blood, we are doing something more than recording those intrinsic facts, which is precisely what, y'all, the descriptive. We are situating these facts relative to a system of values that we hold. It is intrinsic to us that we hold these values, but the attribution of these values to nature, independent of us, is observer relative, meaning that it depends on an observer, it depends on us, right? It is relative to us as we exist and observe these things. Even when we discover a function in nature, as when we discovered the function of the heart, the discovery consists in the discovery of the causal processes together with the assignment of a teleology to those causal processes. This is shown by the fact that a whole vocabulary of success and failure is now appropriate that is not appropriate to simple brute facts of nature. Thus we can speak of malfunction, heart disease, and better and worse hearts. We do not speak of better and worse stones, unless of course we have assigned a function to the stone. If we use the stone as a weapon or a paperweight or an objet d'art trouvé, for example, we can assess its adequacy under these functional descriptions. And to be clear, y'all, this is not for me to say that we have a simple and clear perception of how things actually are in the world in the usual sense that like a scientist will say. There are problems with that as well. But insofar as we can talk about of the descriptive, it should never be a discourse of excess, of too much or too little, of good and bad, of et cetera, because these are always already value judgments.
Yeah, I mean, you can see this often in the language of evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, right? Where there's this language often that people come back to of this thing evolved for the betterance of this other thing. When evolution, even as Darwin lays it out, is not really so teleological towards a certain end. It's a complex interaction over time, which produces organisms that are in more or less balance with the forces in a situation, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. We have one last paragraph before we get to the second term, which is going to be harm.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Who wants to read this one?
Read this real quick.
Popcorn.
Okay.
Awesome.
Thus a question emerges. How do we demarcate sexual excess in the same clear and distinct way we demarcate what is excessive in food and sleep? It is clear that these ethical borders of excess are not exclusively drawn by the body, but are also defined by a motivational state which produces harm to the self and harm to the object, used as a means to achieving the end of gratification. The latter demonstrates why lust is intrinsically connected to selfishness. It is gratification-centered, aiming at the self's pleasure rather than mutual good. In its mature form, it does not concern itself with whether the other flourishes. It only asks whether the other satisfies.
And here, harm is defined as any non-trivial impairment of a person's well-being or personhood, physical, psychological, relational, or moral, such that their flourishing, autonomy, or dignity is diminished. Here, I think the important thing to note is that there's there's almost a naive or uncomplicated sense in which something like harm is attempting to be established, when we might ask harm according to whom, caused by what, by whom, decided by whom that it's harm, right?
Yeah. Shushat was saying this before we went live, but there's some things in this article that aren't true with others' lived experiences, and I think this is one thing. Like somebody isn't necessarily harmed by being used sexually, for example. Like it could just be a neutral experience.
Mhm.
Like for example,
Right.
if you're offering somebody like a sexual favor for their birthday, if you're married, that happens all the time. And maybe you're not like super into it, but you're doing it because you love the other person and because you want them to be happy. Um, that's not harmful for you necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where something like an economic arrangement that causes people to do things that are not like in this sort of optimal state for their flourishing. How do you have an account of that? Like, is you paying a roofer to re-roof your house propagating a kind of harm? I mean, who's to say, right? It's a complicated question.
Am
but
I
the roofer
am I
certainly
propagating the harm of landlords by paying my rent? Yeah.
Like the roofer certainly wouldn't say so. You're paying them for the job. Presumably, they're happy to have the work, or they wouldn't be taking it on. Hopefully,
Mhm.
right? There can be people who are in a desperate situation, but still, the economic relation or transaction isn't necessarily where you might point to harm appearing.
Yeah.
Even assuming harm in this sort of naive sense.
She needs to define harm because she's making a sort of consequentialist argument about the about why not about lustful behavior. But the problem is that this doesn't apply to what she defines as lust that is purely internal. Like if you're having a sexual fantasy about somebody who's already in a relationship and you never like act on it.
Right. It could be even intensely gratifying for the person engaging in that in some instances, right?
Mhm.
This is where a notion of sort of best interest is going to enter by way of Aristotle and Telos.
Mhm.
And we'll see that later on.
I think another question that will enter here is, to what extent can somebody be a co-participant in their harm? Are they just as culpable as the person who is making them the object of their desire
You mean like somebody
within this
who
framework?
I don't know, somebody
Who
who
offers
dresses in a
themselves up,
revealing way?
or like as you said before, somebody who offers themselves up for a sexual favor, right?
Yeah.
Are they a co-participant in some form of harm, even if that harm is something that they willingly take on to themselves?
Mhm.
Well, I think we kind of bypass the question because this notion of harm already doesn't really acknowledge what or how harm arises. It's already working from a notion outside of the person's actually in the relation, where harm is to have any definitive statement on something like harm. You have to be doing what she'll do later and have an idea of best interest, right? Something that someone else has decided is for the best interest of the people involved in a relation.
All right. Who wants to read next?
I can go for it.
I'll go.
Okay.
Regarding the former, lust as a harm to the self, it is harmful because it strips the self's personhood. This is distinct from what is established earlier, as this is not concerning instrumentalizing other persons, but instrumentalizing the self. So now we're getting into what we were just talking about. As I have established previously, individuals possess intrinsic moral value, and that value grounds dignity. The self is not merely a bundle of animalistic instincts and impulses, but a rational and intelligent being. Yet lust, as I have defined it, is not rationally determined. It is appetite ungoverned. And when one repeatedly allows appetite to direct the intellect, one steps down from the posture of a person, an autonomous agent, to a heteronomous thing which is moved by impulse. This loss of autonomy is a violation of one's own dignity, a failure to treat the self as something worthy of governance, and thus is a violation of personhood. Beyond this, lust produces a fragmented identity in which the self becomes oriented toward pursuing external and unfulfilling things rather than internal fulfillment and stable character, producing a dissonance that undermines integrity. In that condition, one not only objectifies others, they begin to objectify themselves, valuing gratification over virtue, personhood, and the cultivation of a stable and moral inner essence.
Oh boy, this one was jam-packed with stuff to go over. I do want to say,
I mean, we're sort
what's
of dealing
interesting
with
here-
a secular idea of sin here, is what it seems like to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Listen. That's all this is. All we're really doing here is trying to secular and putatively descriptive grounds to establish moral claims, which are basically going to function in the way that sin used to, right? Because oftentimes the ethical becomes the secularization of a divine of a divine of a divine codus of dictates. And so I want to. It's actually on that point, Trisha. I'm glad you opened it up that way, because what we're also seeing here is there's going to be a marriage, an attempted marriage, of the moral and the rational. So what we're going to see, and what we've already been seeing a little bit, is that insofar as certain ways of going about sex in Raz's thinking undermines the rational aspect of the subject, and insofar as the subject is really only that which is precisely rational for Raz, there's a violation here that can be seen as detrimental. And in that sense of detriment, that's when the moral imperative arrives. We must not debase ourselves, degrade ourselves, do harm to our subjectivity. And this is where the imperative arrives. So you can see here how we go from a certain conception of subjectivity as being married with the rational, and the undermining of the rational, thus being the undermining of the subject, and the sense of this being detrimental being what allows for a moral claim and prohibitions upon certain activities on the basis of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's almost like a weird kind of sexual or secular spirituality almost.
Yeah, I think for to be succinct about it, for viewers to help to kind of think through this, a lot of this is going to be a kind of secular spirituality. A lot of this is going to be kind of things that are conveniently in perfect accord with, say, for example, religious ways of going about our behaviors and inclinations, but put in secular slash, and by this we mean like terrestrial, biological, anatomical terms. That's going to be what a lot of this ends up becoming. And then from this, trying to produce a kind of legislation, right? Trying to produce a certain type of life that we can legislate onto others. An imperative upon how others ought live, which is really what's at the basis with this entire article, right? That's the drive of this article in my view.
Are we ready for the next paragraph, or did you guys have other comments?
Go for it, Trisha.
August, Richard, okay.
Oh, I was just going to do a quick time check. We've been going for like 90 minutes ish. And we have a long way to go to get through section 1 if we're trying to do that.
Okay.
But we don't have to get through section 1. I just wanted to let people know.
Yeah, We'll do like next few paragraphs and just kind of like check in with each other and see how we feel about continuing.
Sounds good.
Just as sexual desire can be expressed through the negative medium of lust, it may also be expressed through love. This is where love enters a stark contrast, not as a sentiment, but as an ethical orientation. The meaning of the word love is even more polysemous than lust, but I will use it in three senses. 1, love for another. 2, love for the self. And 3, romantic love. God, it reminds me so much of the language from the Bible. Thou must love thyself as I love thee, or something like that. From as a commandment from God. Beginning with the first, love for another can be understood as something concerning altruism and union. It is a willing of the other's good, that is, wanting the best for them. It possesses a sense of selflessness that allows them to thrive alongside yourself, simultaneously. In regards to union, it is viewing the other as an extension of you, and you as an extension of them. It is a shared virtue of two selves progressing to a higher state, for the sake of one another and with each other in mind. As for love of the self, this refers to a virtuous kind of self-care, aimed at self-actualization and developing a noble moral character. A good moral individual will not only provide a path of self-actualization for themselves, but for others as well, by being a source of good. Finally, romantic love, which I will define as something that is reciprocal and emotionally intense union, combining love of another and love of the self, expressed through exclusive attachment. I emphasize exclusivity heavily here because romantic love, if it is to be the apex of union, requires a level of devotion that is not dispersed. Monogamy here is not a religious or patriarchal claim, but a philosophical claim about what love is. To will the good of a beloved and to will the good of the union is to order oneself toward that union as a priority. A non-exclusive dynamic may be negotiated without immorality in some narrow procedural sense, but it does not constitute the fullest form of love as devotion, because devotion directed elsewhere fractures the conditions needed for maximal mutual flourishing. It creates inherent asymmetric. It creates inherent asymmetries and threatens reciprocity. Romantic love, as I am defining it, must be exclusive because it aims at a particular kind of union, one that can actually be maximized. Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. I see the sense of like a duty from outside, from like the socius being directed onto the self, and you have like some kind of duty to be a good person, not just for your own sake, but to be a good person in the world, and that model has to do with to the benefit of the broader society. And then
Yes.
towards the end,
Go ahead.
and then towards the end, this idea that like that devotion can be split in this way, and that if you have too many of these ties, you're somehow diluting something that needs to be absolutely pure and singular.
Right. I think this that can actually be maximized is one of the hinging parts of this paragraph. That there's this notion of the good, sort of following on from Plato and Aristotle, that needs to be that you have a duty to maximize in your life through your engagements, and here there's a lot of assumptions going into things like there's discussion of non-exclusive dynamics, right? So she's saying a non-exclusive dynamic may be negotiated without immorality in some narrow procedural sense, but it does not constitute the fullest form of love as devotion. And so devotion here, we're going to get into it later. I don't want to jump ahead too much, but her notion of devotion, despite using the language of something like self-actualization, is relatively divorced from the mental realm, where we talked about this before, Imran, right? Where the mental is this, if you're doing dualism, if you're doing this sense of the mental and the material, something like devotion, the giving over of oneself fully, is something that happens internally in the mind, in this sense of like a forfeiture of agency to another. But here, the exclusivity is being really important. So, for example, if you have devotion to something else, what does that leave your devotion to the person in this union? That's the thing that she's pointing towards, right?
Right. And so, okay, to make this more comprehensible for viewers, making devotion material simply means that you are giving it a finitude. In other words, you are giving it a finite quantity.
Yeah, it's
And
quantitative rather than qualitative.
Yes, and insofar as it bears quantity, being a finite thing in the world, it can be, in a sense, divided, right? And so you can have, for example, not all of one's devotion going somewhere, in the same way that we might talk about the division of energy within the body, or the division of blood cells and their passage through veins. Things that have quantity are not limitless, and insofar as having a limit, can be apportioned within that limit in certain ways. And so the move here is how we justify something like devotion being considered as this kind of quantitative sort of a thing, when, as August pointed out, devotion, in the way that it's been classically considered, something like devotion or loyalty or whatever else, something that would be considered a virtue, is not at all quantitative, because that means it would concern the life
Richard,
of the body.
Estelle is saying in chat that you did not mute your stream microphone when you muted your mic, so there might have been something coming through there.
I've muted my Discord, but not my microphone.
That's what Estelle is saying.
Apparently, there's some devilish feedback. Is it me? Am I the one feedbacking through? It might be me.
I mean, it sounds fine to me for now. Maybe Estelle could point out what was coming through, but that's okay.
It could be my voice twice. Hold on.
Okay. No, I don't think it's a doubling. I think that they were just pointing it out because maybe you were talking or something while muted. But that's okay.
Oh, it sounded like, was it a comment about feedback? Oh, okay, whatever. I'll carry on for now.
Oh wait, so I get what Estelle is saying. I muted myself on Discord, but the sounds that I make here are still coming through the stream.
Yeah.
Aha. For chatters who are unaware, we're not that kind of a nerd. We're like the read old books, talk about them kinds of nerds. Not the super duper tech whiz kind of nerd. I mean, anyway, you should expect this if you're watching President Sunday. So I don't know what you want from us people, but anyway. Now,
sorry,
okay.
Viewers.
Getting back to the point, our diminishing chat right in front of our eyes. Getting back to the point. Devotion has classically been understood as being accorded with the mind, not the body. And insofar as it's been accorded with the mind within the history of philosophy, it has been accorded with that which does not bear extension. This is the res cogitans for Descartes, which, for example, that which is split from the res extensa, that which splits from the extended, right? For Descartes, the dualism is you have the immaterial stuff that is that relates to the mind and the soul and its divine endowment by God, and the body, which is this finite, extended, meaning that it has extension in space. That's all that means. Spatiotemporal extension. You can measure it, you can put a ruler to it, a caliper, whatever else. These two things have an absolute split, which we call a split of substance. So the mind we consider a distinct substance from that of literally matter, right? And so devotion, being a virtue, is usually a virtue of the mind, is usually something that it regards yourself as a subject. By the way, the subject-object distinction is oftentimes thought in these terms as well, where the subject is precisely that which doesn't bear extension, and oftentimes that which is considered an entirely distinct substance endowed by God, etc., vis-a-vis the object, right? In fact, it has been traditional for philosophers to say that we are not wholly ourselves, which is precisely why we can have a self that we are not wholly our body, which is why we can possess our body as a self. The self is on the side of the immaterial that can possess the material, right? And so, all this to say that this is actually one of the weird and interesting eccentricities that we get from this article, where something like devotion, which is supposed to be an artifact of the immaterial, gets moved into the material by implication, because you can exhaust it, because it can be apportioned, and because, therefore, it has terrestrially bounded limits, like a body or like a thing in the body. And of course, this then has to be demonstrated. But I think that's what August is kind of broadly pointing to.
Yeah. Let's continue on. This claim is not merely my own stipulation. It is echoed by Aristotle's account of friendship and love in the Nicomachean Ethics. Though he does not explicitly stipulate that relations must be exhaustive, Aristotle describes true friendship as a shared dyadic union, in which both individuals share the pursuit of the good and will each other's flourishing and guard each other's virtue. He himself acknowledges that true friendships will be rare precisely because such deep reciprocal knowledge and mutual moral orientation takes time. Note that the term friendship here is arguably a poor translation from Greek, as Aristotle also refers to marital relationships similarly as philia, which refers to some shared life aimed at common ends.
Yeah, somebody in chat, I think it was San, brought up Greek forms of love earlier, and
Yeah.
she only gets into philia.
Yeah.
Not eros, curiously.
Well, I think there might be a little bit of a reason for that. Eros, oftentimes, within the world of antiquity, so in this case, let's say the classical world, the Greek world, the Aegean world, however you want to consider it, oftentimes is seen as a kind of madness, or I think it was Plato who called it the finest madness in Symposium, or sorry, Socrates, excuse me. Plato, Socrates, whatever. And at the same time, it has to be inflicted, no? Within the Greek cosmology, there's a cherubic figure who shoots you with an arrow, and then it's an infliction. It's an affliction that's the result of an infliction. It comes from without. It's not this productive building up sort of a thing. It's actually something much more.
Yeah, you don't decide who to fall in love with. Yeah.
Right, and there's even a question of whether it can even be rationally arbitrated, insofar as it's considered something like a madness. Actually, if you would allow me this indulgence, I have a classical dictionary that talks all about this, which is, I think, a very Imran thing to have, a classical dictionary. For viewers who are interested, I highly recommend getting yourself the Oxford Classical Dictionary. Anything you could ever want to look up. It's like instead of going to whatever, Claude or whomever else you ask these questions to, there is a collection of scholars who have endeavored to basically define whatever needs defining within the Greek world. In this case, within the classical world, meaning both the Greek and Roman world. And so there's a section here on how they consider something like eros. And actually, this might speak to precisely why Raz will not bring up Eros, but will be interested in things like agape, or not things like agape, things like Aristotelian friendship and so on and so forth. Now, if we look here to this section on Eros, it'll be said, hold on, just give me a second, I'm flipping to it. Eros. Here we go, Eros. With Himeros, desire, and Pothos, longing, Eros is a constant companion of Aphrodite. Sorry, give me a second here. Okay, here we go. Hesiod seems to have transformed the Homeric conception of Eros. Although he describes Eros in terms identical with Homer, as a god who loosens the limbs and damages the mind, interesting, he also makes him, together with Earth and Tartarus, the oldest of all gods. With Eros as a cosmic principle, Parmenides. Sorry, give me a second here. Sorry, this is really old school. We're going straight to the text. Maybe I'll come back to this. But the point here is
Yeah, why
that,
not save it
this-
for when we make the essay response?
For example, though, but there's a point here where Hesiod kind of relates to the kind of damaging of the mind, and that's kind of what's at stake and what I'm trying to say here. In that, it's not this thing that's just like productive or even necessarily ethical. It's something that is an infliction. It's a madness. It's a damaging of the mind. It loosens the limbs, etc., etc. It's again, it's violence, even quote unquote gothic, if you wanna import that phrase from posterity. It's that kind of a thing, and I think that might perhaps be why Eros is, maybe a reason why Eros is left out of this sort of her postulating, basically.
There's also an interesting thing that I don't think she really contends with, which is that I don't believe for Aristotle the dyadic union. I'm not actually sure if he uses the term dyadic union when talking about friendship, but that when he talks about the two souls becoming one, that he does not say that it's actually exclusive.
Yeah,
Okay.
it might just be the simplest way of talking about a dynamic, because we could see the
Yeah.
trio as three pairs of dyadic unions.
Yeah. Yeah, precisely. And so it's an understanding of both people in the friendship enhancing virtue, sort of pushing in the same direction, having the things that are important internally to Aristotle be reciprocated in the other, but there's not really anything about it that makes it exclusive. You can have multiple friendships that
That are all
have
fruitful.
this sort of shared virtue.
Yeah.
Can I say this one last thing? Okay, I have a good section here where it's defined that that it is the violent physical desire that drives Paris to Helen, of course referencing the Iliad, Zeus to Hera, and shakes the limbs of the suitors of Penelope. A more refined conception of this Eros, who affects the mind and body, appears in the archaic lyric poets. Because his power brings peril, he is cunning, unmanageable, cruel. In Anacreon, he smites the love-struck one with an axe or a whip. He comes suddenly like a wind and shakes his victims. Eros is playful, but plays with frenzies and confusion.
Do you think we could return to this later?
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to. That's actually the end of it. But I wanted to kind of just make that, like, drive in that point. We're dealing with something non-productive and non-ethical. Yeah, let's continue.
A predictable objection arises here. Why must romantic love be exclusive if non-exclusive unions can be stable, satisfactory, respectful, and happy, especially in polyfidelous arrangements, which would be like what's the right term? Like a throuple, right?
Yes, she uses the term polyfidelous instead of polyamorous, which I think is interesting.
Polyfidelous is specifically a thing within polyamory where the people in the arrangement are exclusive within the arrangement, right? So it's like a throuple that doesn't date outside, for example.
Okay.
So there's fidelity within a polyamorous relationship.
Mm-hmm. I still take issue with the exclusion of exclusivity, or sorry, non-exclusive dynamics, but carry on.
Yeah, for sure. But I think I kind of want to just go ahead and read this next paragraph because
Yes, of course.
This particular objection assumes that the only morally relevant question is whether or not a structure produces immediate visible harm. But my claim regarding exclusivity is not that every non-exclusive relationship produces harm or is necessarily immoral. My claim is stronger and more precise. Exclusivity is a condition of maximal union, the apex form of romantic love as devotion, given the teleological ends romantic love aims at. Thus, my answer begins with a distinction that is evidently ignored by this inquiry, which is the distinction between what is morally permissible, what is morally good, and what is morally better. First is moral permissibility. An action is permissible when it does not violate moral obligations, essentially allowed. Permissibility does not automatically imply praiseworthiness. Many choices are permissible, yet morally neutral. Choosing to eat a burger instead of a salad is generally permissible. It is neither a profound moral achievement nor immoral. Second is moral goodness. An action is good when it has positive moral value, reflecting features such as virtue, kindness, or altruism. Giving your food to someone who is starving is not merely permissible, it is actively good. Third is moral betterness, a comparative scale that allows us to distinguish between two options that may be both permissible and even both good, while one is nonetheless better, more excellent, more aligned with virtue, more conducive to flourishing. Giving food to someone who is starving is good, but giving food and additional money to help them later is, ceteris paribus, morally better. One objectively yields more goodness. Sunday in chat putting his burger down. Yeah, you're not maximally ingratiating the good, Sunday. Sorry. You're engaging in gluttony. Yeah, I mean, I think this speaks to a lot of our objections leading up to here, where it's this idea of morality that is not just there's nothing there's these moral oughts that are embedded within this telos of an assumed end, right? The teleological ends that romantic love aims at, again, the sort of the maximal union. And so the person defining that's where it goes back to that discussion on best interest, right? Best interest gets to be decided by people not part of a particular dynamic, to then tell those people that their dynamic is not aiming at the true, rightly placed end point of what they should be doing.
Yeah, I also
or not
don't think she
to any
addresses the
harm.
critique, right? Because she doesn't explain how non-exclusive unions or polyfidelous arrangements are less moral than the two, because she doesn't explain why it's good to obtain the maximal union.
Yes, it's
We'll kind of
it's
get there.
considered. Yeah, it's something that she's relying on an implicit favoritism towards, that is not justified within the article itself.
I would say, yeah. Well, I would say that she tries to bring it back to this notion of flourishing, right? And so, and it's going to come back to devotion. So it's going to come back to things that split up devotion, are going to, in a sense, lessen the ability for the other that is being devoted to have the maximal flourishing necessary that's implied by the relationship, by the union.
Right,
I think
but
that's
there's no thing that she does that says why, for example, flourishing half as much with two different people is morally worse than, like, she doesn't justify this axiom.
Yeah,
all
what you
within
mean?
the right.
You mean specifically the axiom of flourishing in the utmost in this very
Yeah, that
particular.
specifically
Mm.
the dyadic is the maximal flourishing.
Oh, I
It's-
see.
Yeah, specifically because she does go on to, and we can, I think, skim this section a little bit because it gets a little bit, I think.
Well, actually, you know what?
Redundant.
Sorry, before we do that, I like that point that you were trying to make because, for example, I think nowadays it's almost a kind of it's kind of conventionally understood in psychology that, for example, if there's only one outlet for your ability to say, for example, talk about problems or what's going on in your life, that this is, in a sense, actually lessening your ability to quote unquote flourish by Raz's standards. Then, in fact, you want a plurality of relationships in that direction, um, to be quote unquote maximally flourishing or whatever, or just
Right,
live.
we would almost
just
never
live
say
better
that
Not
than
about
only
everyone else.
that-
friendships. Like,
Well, not only
Right.
that, but you're
you only
also
maximally benefit from friendship when you have one friend that fulfills all needs all at once perfectly. Like no one would go about it this way. It's
you
more
need
about
you need to strive for the platonic ideal of a friend and exclude everything else.
precisely. Yeah.
No,
And not only this, but this also
Yeah.
excludes you from the possibility, from all the myriad possibilities of relationships that you might have that you have no way of predicting how they will go or how they will occur, that may actually be better than the ones that you're currently seeking. You're sort of like preemptively cutting yourself off
Well, yeah. I
from
mean,
Yeah.
a world of friendship and love.
That's a problem with marriage.
Richard going right into it. Actually, I want to speculate very quickly and say that I think what undergirds the justification of exclusivity is actually not at all flourishing. I think this is a very posterior way of trying to formulate it. I suspect that what drives the desire or to, let's say, not legislate, but the desire to posit an exclusive or dyadic relation as one which is the most flourishing one, in fact, does not come from some notion of trying to be true to flourishing at all. I think it's coming from somewhere else and being justified in a posterior way by the idea of flourishing.
I'm going to go ahead and say we can skip this next paragraph. I don't think it's necessary and basically reiterates the same points of the last paragraph.
This is the one where. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. So do you want to
that's
start
right,
with the structure in place?
Yes. The structure in place being that 3 types of good.
Mm-hmm.
With this structure in place, we can return to the claim of exclusivity. My argument is not non-exclusive relationships are always impermissible. To assume this is to strawman my argument. Instead, my argument is conditional and teleological. If true romantic love is defined as a reciprocal union aiming at mutual recognition, deep vulnerability, maximal mutual flourishing, and self-actualization, it aims at an apex form of devotion. Then exclusivity necessarily follows as a requirement of that end. If instead one's relationship is primarily pragmatic, transactional, or oriented towards ends other than the maximal romantic union, then exclusivity does not necessarily follow. Acts and relationship structures in this context are elevated relative to their desired ends.
Evaluated.
So again, we're running into the same issue where she hasn't laid out a justification for why there's a maximal union achieved in a dyadic relationship.
Yeah.
Well, not only that,
if you're
but she's like
polyamorous-
carving. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, if you're polyamorous, she's saying like, yeah, you might be acceptable, but you're never going to.
You're never going to
achieve
experience
the
true
best.
love.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, and it's worth noting the lines of this become quite blurry, where it's like, So she's saying you're not morally impermissible if you're engaging in casual sex or polyamory, but you are engaging in a less good. So you are not elevating the good, which in itself, it blurs the line between like, okay, it's not impermissible, but what does that actually mean? She's still obviously arguing for the thing that she's arguing for, which is the exclusive dyadic union. So whether or not it's impermissible seems like basically a semantic distinction, not a substantive one.
I agree, because I think, by the way, what you could always point out here is you can always make the kind of more implicit or interior argument of, say, for example, one ought to maximize, or rather, one ought to always pursue the morally better in her terminology, right? And at that level, you've just reproduced the binary ought that for how we should treat this somehow literally non-binary construction of moral levels, moral hierarchies. Because I mean, to your point, sorry, to make that less convoluted, it's always going to flatten. It's always going to flatten into something like a binary of that which one ought do and one ought not do. You can't actually expand it out this way. You could try, but as August points out, it's just going to be semantic. At bottom, at a substantive level of like when it comes to the behaviors we ought to be having, it's always going to be a binary predicated on some kind of like absolute distinction between what you really should try to do, at least try to do, versus what you shouldn't try to do.
Yeah, I mean, so this next section, I think we can also sort of skim through because it's a little bit, I think, needlessly wordy. But here, I'm going to start from let devotion be the stable allocation of goods such as attention, sexual satisfaction, time and energy, life planning, protective loyalty, reputational care, and so forth. Devotion is paramount in producing the aims mentioned, and devotion is a finite resource, not because humans cannot love deeply, but because humans do not possess an infinite amount of time, energy, attention, and so forth. As a lived allocation, devotion cannot be infinite. This is really, really important for understanding the ways that this piece is starting to internally fall apart. And in this section, where, as pointed out earlier in our discussion, devotion is not something that is qualitative. Here, she is strictly defining it as not just quantitative, but actually fixed quantitative, where there's not a dynamic notion of what can or can't be given, but an extremely finite fixed notion where you start with a certain amount of like love points. And again, love is treated as something completely separate from all other substances. It's treated as a separate substance. And so you end up with this weird notion that actually doesn't really work with some of the Aristotelian and Kantian notions. But we can get into that as we continue.
You do not have sufficient attention coins to love this person.
Yeah. See, you gotta. No, okay, I totally agree. And what's interesting here is that there's never the idea floated that maybe one person will never actually have enough to fulfill the other person. Like, what happens if, for example, within any particular relation, someone actually always requires more than what the other person has in their finite stock of devotion quanta?
Or that there could be a configuration such that someone's level of devotion, vulnerability, what are the other things mentioned? Life planning, protective loyalty, etc., could be expanded upon in a different dynamic. And as mentioned, it's literally about time, energy, and attention. And so even something like a notion of friendship is actually excluded from this notion automatically because this itself requires time, energy, attention. And so in the way that she is laying it out, you can literally only have one person satisfying any of these needs, that of the romantic soul pair partner.
this is an interesting point, because it sounds to me like you're trying to say that, for example, you can have even too many friendships that detract from your ability to show maximal devotion to the partner.
Right. Well,
Yeah, so it seems,
any friendship
yeah.
would, because it's about a
Right.
maximization. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, totally. And so in this, so really you can end up in a very monstrous situation where someone is saying, look, listen, Jeffrey, I think you hang out with Mike too much. Well, we just get drinks after work. No, but the problem is when you get drinks after work, you're using up some of your finite resources that are supposed to go to helping maximize my flourishing, like I'm helping maximize yours. You see how it can become very sinister.
A weird hostage situation. Yeah.
Yeah, and where does the notion of something like work or means of survival even fit into this? Like, is it your moral duty to spend less time working, for example, to maximize the good by having a greater amount of time, energy, and attention to spend on your partner? Even if it means sacrificing other things. Well, there's not really an account that gives us an answer in this.
It's
I'm gonna
interesting
continue
also,
on
I
here.
think,
Oh,
because there's like a negative definition of morality, right? Like the morals are it's good as long as you don't treat somebody as a means to an end, right? There's not a
yes.
positive end given morally.
Right. Morality is that which you are restricted from. And I think an interesting point about that is it sort of goes back to the nature culture discussion, where, and the teleological discussion writ large, where there's this notion that there's like this balance that has to be maintained. So you ought not do things that disrupt this balance, because this balance is itself the sort of morality things are based around. So it leaves you in this place of necessarily having an incredibly repression-focused morality, where you are always inhibiting things as to allow the natural right thing to have its role.
By the way, I did want to point out a wonderful comment we got. We do read comments, y'all, so please keep commenting your ideas. Matt B has a wonderful comment where he kind of asks, or where they kind of ask, I don't know Matt's pronouns, but where they kind of ask, where do kids show up in this relationship, right? Wouldn't having a child, or even especially more than one child, inhibit the ability to show maximal devotion to the partner so as to ensure their flourishing is at the utmost, as much as can be done?
Yeah, I made this point when we first read the article. Like this isn't doesn't have much to do with like complicating a polyamorous dynamic, but it really but it inherently prevents you from giving your maximum to one person.
Right, that's the tension and the sort of the breaking introduced with this extremely sort of writ material, I say that in a loose sense of like literal physical finite time and attention being given the foremost in this equation, where it actually starts to fall apart when you discuss anything, because even something like love being separate from any other thing in your life suddenly falls apart, where love can't be the special substance as earlier talked about, because it's actually on an even playing field in terms of time, energy, as everything else. And so everything else is now no longer in service of the sort of the perfect good.
Right, totally agree.
Olivia said, if you're not going to devotion max, then no passions, hobbies, or cares that have any social good. Precisely, yeah. And Shakespeare earlier mentions aromanticism. I actually don't know whether aromanticism plays much of a role in this discussion, because I don't think she's actually interested in romance because it's about this. It's actually about devotion, not about romance. Romance is something sort of subsumed under this larger category of devotion.
Do you guys want to breeze through the next section?
Yeah. So she gives a lengthy account of the, and when we say like a physical or a material account of attention, she means it incredibly literally, like having an actual number like 100 units that you can then divide in different ways. And so I think we can glide by that part a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, basically the point is just that you can't maximize with multiple people. Okay, then she goes, the argument is not only arithmetic.
Still no justification for why like maximal depth in a single relationship. Again, this idea of this having to like mathematically divide it is what's holding it back, when the things that she actually talked about valuing are not necessarily mathematically divisible in that way. Some of them are, some of them aren't, but there's again a mixing.
Okay. So she says, but the argument is not only arithmetic, it is also about reciprocity and fairness. A maximal romantic union requires reciprocity not merely defined by a lack of harm, but as equal standing. Non-exclusive dynamics may be consensual, but in practice, they tend to introduce asymmetries in the distribution of resources. Structural asymmetry undermines reciprocity and fairness, which undermines maximal mutual flourishing and deep vulnerability. And vulnerability in particular requires rational assurance and trust that devotion will not be reduced or redirected. Even though polyfidelous relationships may report confidence and stability, that stability is attained only through structural compromises. Devotion is dispersed by design, and the apex union is therefore not achieved in the same sense. So, to summarize plainly for those who may be lost, a union is that which aims at a shared we, a joint project where A and B are mutually primary in romantic devotion. If a person holds two romantic unions simultaneously, romantic devotion cannot be fully directed to both without division. A full union requires non-division of devotion if the aim is to maximize romantic love, which includes love of the self and love of another. Therefore, a fully instantiated romantic union requires exclusivity. This should clarify my view regarding open or poly relationships. My concern is not permissibility. Even if non-exclusive dynamics yield a lower overall devotion yield per union or introduce structural inequalities, they may be consented to, and consent can render them morally permissible in a narrow procedural sense. And relative to particular teleological ends such as survival, provision, pragmatic alliance in conditions of scarcity, non-exclusive structures can be justified and might be morally good or better. However, if the end is what contemporary relationships claim to seek, which is romantic love as I have defined it, then exclusivity is not merely permissible but morally better. It is the structure best fitted to that end. Monogamy is uniquely conducive to maximal union because it allows devotion to be undivided and reciprocity to be straightforward. A polyfidelous relationship may be consensual, and it may be satisfying, and it may be stable, but satisfaction is not the same thing as maximality. Thus, non-exclusive structures are fundamentally incapable of producing the kind of maximal romantic union that monogamy so effortlessly provides. Now that I've established the definitions of love and lust, you can understand more clearly what I mean when I say sexual desire can be expressed by either medium. When expressed through love, sexual expression is not merely a selfish pleasure, but a vehicle for intimacy, vulnerability, mutual affirmation, and reciprocal satisfaction. It keeps both persons in view. It does not reduce the other to an instrument. Rather, it treats the other as a co-participant in a shared good. The expression of love through physical and sexual means refers to transcending mere lustful gratification, as it is something which intensifies love of another and simultaneously allows the self to be loved. because sexuality, when properly ordered, requires a kind of exposure and nakedness that only makes sense under trust. And in surrendering yourselves, you are both selflessly intent on satisfying each other, achieving a mutual apex of gratification rather than a singular selfish one. Sexual desire, when expressed through lust, on the other hand, becomes consumption. It becomes a practice of using. The other is a tool, the pleasure is the end. This inevitably produces harm, if not immediately invisible injury, then by psychological degradation, the conditioning of perception into objectification, the erosion of respect, the weakening of loyalty, and the habituation of selfish appetite. Now that I've stipulated the distinction between the expression of sexual desire, I would like to provide one final stipulation. Attraction is not identical with sexual desire. Attraction is broader. It is a response to what is visually or aesthetically harmonious, emotionally moving, or pleasing. Hence why scenery or art can be described as attractive. Sexual desire involves attraction, but not all attraction is sexual. This additional distinction is meaningful because the ethical problem at hand is not that humans notice beauty, it is that humans cultivate a way of noticing that collapses persons into bodies and bodies into parts. Okay, I'll stop here for now.
Oh, is Richard's voice clipping a little bit for anyone else, or is that just me?
Hard for me to say. What about you, Shot? I feel like I heard everything that Richard said. I don't know if his voice is clipping for me.
Clipping as in like the end of speaking seemed a little cut off, but that's okay. We'll talk about that later.
That's likely the crisp noise gating thing.
Right.
Anyway, I'm glad we read through that without commenting too much, because that was more so just a kind of basic recapitulation without any of the actual arguments. It was just kind of just giving various restatements on the matter, I feel like. No?
Yeah, I mean, I think the callback to psychological degeneration or degradation is going to be important for later sections of the article, also referenced in the introduction, where it's this idea of the person choosing at the center, and anything that she perceives as getting in the way of this moral actor choosing is by necessity like a degradation.
What I notice is that we're able to. So remember how what's really at stake with this article, to a certain extent, is trying to delineate out something like inner life vis-a-vis behavior, and that one's inner life can be quote unquote dominated by excessive sexual. Well, I guess to go back to the term that she used, a kind of making everything sexualized in a way that's excessive and therefore somehow leaves the subject a kind of riven husk or something like this. Which ends up becoming just like offenses to one's rationality, it seems like. And if that's the case, it seems like she's taken some pains to say you can notice beauty, you can find things attractive, and you can even find things, and you can even have a sexual life without it being lustful or in excess. And so, I mean, I wonder if she could be more, because she hasn't really done this yet. I wonder if she could be more specific of like, give us a case. Philosophy is not always simply just dealing with universals. Give us a case in which someone has moved from noticing or appreciation or something like this into producing a lustful thing within their inner life that wouldn't be behavioral, right? I would like to see an instance of this actually being the case.
She talks a little bit about this in section 3.
We'll get there another day.
Yeah.
There's one last point we have to read before we finish up this section. I think I can read this one. To be clear, it is not morally necessary to act on beauty. There are forms of appreciation that remain exactly that, recognition without consumption. The problem begins when appreciation becomes a compulsion to act, possess, comment, or extract gratification. At that point, beauty is no longer being noticed. It is being used. This is the clear distinction between admiring a trait and reducing a person to the trait, between seeing beauty as one feature of a whole human being and treating the beauty as the person. Appreciation, which makes you feel compelled to always act upon beauty, is problematic. Further, such a form of desire is objectification of the self, training their sexuality to value stimulus rather than character and personhood. Yeah, I also want to say, act, possess, comment, extract gratification. These all seem to be within the realm of behaviors or things dealing with the material, things dealing with extensivity. It doesn't seem to me to accord with something like the inner life, or it doesn't necessarily preclude the external as the inner life. Does that make sense? Hello?
Hello.
Oh, I didn't catch what you said there. Yeah.
Oh, no, I was saying that the 4 examples she gives here, act, possess, comment, extract gratification, these all seem like highly internal or things dealing with one's behavior, and not at
Yes.
all necessarily being that of the inner life. And so that's kind of, we'll see what happens in section 3, but I'm suspicious that in section 3 we'll just get more behaviors. We'll just get things that are just more within the world of externalized experience. So
Well, yeah, 'cause I
I'm
think that
yeah.
that's necessarily like I think it's a thing of both the teleological way it's being introduced, but also the like essence and appearance distinction. Once again, we're sort of going back to where there's this idea of these actions in the world that she's taking issue with, right? The sort of pseudo-feminist idea of objectification that she's using, and other things, male and in some cases female behavior that does not fit her model of morality. And so to explain those, she's sort of positing this essence of lust behind the actions, and which leaves you in a weird place where you have to contend with the essence behind the appearance directly, while talking not at very much length about the actual actions.
It's like an
Agreed.
essence. It's like an essence that haunts like a ghost.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, okay, but this is the thing, though. I mean, August is right in that a lot of this is going to be predicated on a kind of. This is a very classical model of philosophy. For those who don't realize, the philosophy of essence and appearance, you get this as early as people like Plato. This is like at the beginning. This is kind of the inaugural way of doing philosophy with the Greeks and everything.
I would even point
of course,
towards Aristotle had the idea of form imposing itself on matter, right? And so there's this thing
Right.
prior to matter that's the driving force behind what we actually see in a specific form. Is it the hylomorphism? Is that correct?
I don't know if that's the term. I have no clue. But
But,
no, I mean,
yeah, this
exactly
idea of-
the same in Plato. Yeah.
Right, yeah. And so this idea of something like lust being the form which is driving the desire, driving the actions, is sort of being posited here. And I think that this is an appealing proposition for some people. Like, one of the things we mentioned in the opening was that this article actually was very popular. And we found that really interesting. And so one of the things that we can use to explain it, I think, is precisely this explanation, this essence and appearance distinction, where it gives people a sort of a seeming explanation for the phenomena that they're experiencing, to sort of point to and say, I had a relationship that didn't feel right to me. How can I explain this? Oh, there's this lust guiding this person's action that made their actions shaped in a certain way, right? There's this telos to how they were behaving, shaped by a certain essence.
I totally agree. And what's interesting about this, and you made this point kind of earlier in a sense, is that she's not simply trying to give us the creation, or rather the notion of an essential thing behind all of its appearances, of which those appearances are simply expressions of the fundamental thing. She wants to legislate that fundamental, our treatment of that fundamental thing. And this is weird
Yes.
because usually you can
Yes,
only
it
really
is weird.
legislate the apparent, right? You can't really
Exactly.
legislate essences, and that's
At most,
the
you
rub.
can attempt to legislate your own, like for Plato, for example, you might be able to legislate, for example, your own relationship to something like the good, as it's like a form, but you aren't. You're always doing that from like a direct, the way that the good is sort of enacting itself through you as a form. Here, there's almost like a self above the essence that's asserting itself. So there's like another deeper, stronger self essence asserting itself in the way that that lust is attempting to be legislated.
Right, right. And maybe to simplify that a bit, it's simply to say that in order for the essence to be dealt with, it would have to be arbitrated from something that is able to arbitrate it from, in other words, something that is above it that can stand to arbitrate it. And this would be some kind of self that stands above as an arbitrator of the essential and can treat it um, ethically or morally or however you want to consider this. Did I come through?
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Okay,
I didn't have
wonderful.
anything to add to that, but
Okay.
if we want to take call-ins, now is a good time to start as we wrap up the discussion.
Oh, let's
here.
do it. Yeah, no, that's a
Yeah,
great
yeah, yeah.
idea. That's a great idea.
Yeah,
I want to get some community
Olivia,
input.
I think you wanted to hop in earlier. That would be a great time.
Yeah, if anyone's in, by the way, if you do want to call in on this, if you have a take, anything pertaining to what we've just read, it's going to be in the GSL, the Gay Science Laboratory. Just go into the waiting room for call-in channel, and we'll move you in.
Here, I'm going to copy. If you're not already in the Discord, I'm going to copy a link in the chat, and you can head over to the waiting room, and we can pull you in.
In the meanwhile, I think it's to be very clear for people, we have finally gotten to the end of section 1. How do y'all feel about how do y'all feel about, I don't know. I'm still trying to gather how I feel about the way that this paper tries to appropriate like Aristotle and Kant, because I feel, and actually the way in which they're doing this in light of also trying to engage in like certain biological claims, it seems to me that it should be obvious that you can't speak of evolutionary process in this way, or just like certain biological facts or descriptive facts in this way. What's so fascinating about this article is that Raz understands that there are distinctions between the normative and the descriptive, or the normative and or rather, or the prescriptive and the descriptive, however we want to consider this, and yet finds no issue in imbuing descriptivity with prescriptive values. Usually, if someone knows that distinction, for example, something like the is-ought gap, if someone invokes the is-ought gap on you in a conversation, it's reasonable to assume that they would actually know what an is entails and what an ought entails, right? But we don't. But there's a recognition that that these are two different strata, which is already kind of secular in a certain way. While at the same time misrecognizing precisely what belongs to either stratum, and that's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, her treatment of Kant and Aristotle, it's interesting because there's parts of it that sort of seem to work for a time, but especially things like this very vulgar notion of like a finite amount of time that you can like time, energy, devotion thing that you can divvy up in service of the good would not fit at all with a Kantian like categorical imperative. It just doesn't work.
Right. Oh, actually, on that point, no, I totally agree with you. Very, very good point. We have two people in call-ins.
Here, let's
Rumpel and Obliteratus. Okay, we'll take Rumpel for now. Obliteratus, you'll come in afterwards. Hey, what's going on, Rumpel? Oh,
Yeah.
really?
Runs first.
Okay. Well, we'll do a switcheroo. Obliteratus, hey, welcome in.
Hey, sorry, it's
We can
just
have
a
them fight.
real quick comment, very short one actually. I just thought it was really funny when you sort of start to expound on it as this bizarre sort of scarcity of attention. It really sort of, I don't know how to say this. It makes very obvious what the issues are here. This kind of zero-sum economy of attention.
What do you mean by a zero-sum economy of attention?
Like the sort of the way that she's built this out is assuming this kind of I mean, you already kind of brought it to this conclusion of like this really weird dynamic where it's like almost like a Stockholm syndrome, this ideal relationship she's positing. It
Right, with the very
Mhm.
measured out idea, like abstraction of something like attention and devotion.
Yes, and to be to be perfectly frank, it kind of actually looks like how I see a lot of adult committed relationships going. Is that a lot of friendships seem to get shed, and this relationship really just sort of monopolizes the lives of a lot of people who seem to just get married because that's the thing that they're supposed to do at that stage in their life. It's very interesting, actually.
No, I agree with you, Obliteratus. Actually, for those of us, that was a very appropriate use of the notion of the zero sum. All a zero sum game means is that the one party benefits under another party's losing something. So, for example, I get a bigger share of something because you get a lesser share. That would be considered a zero-sum situation. And so it is the case that with Raz, we do enter into something like a zero-sum situation, obviously, because it's like if my devotion, quote unquote, is going elsewhere, you're losing that devotion within her framework, right? So it is a zero-sum
Yeah. I mean,
situation. That's completely right.
in an odd way, also the way that she goes about talking about this dyadic union falls back on a kind of the same thing that she claimed to be wanting to avoid, of treating people as means to an end, where precisely she's treating these contingent, unquantifiable relationships as this quantifiable thing towards a measurable end.
Right, flourishing, precisely.
Yes. Of the good specifically, not necessarily of the people. I mean, she seems to assume that, but specifically she says of the good. I'm gonna
and
you can hang out still, Obliteratus.
well, I just wanted to expound on this real quick before I mute again. But it's just very funny thinking about how this relationship almost immediately starts to defeat itself if a person outgrows this, right? Because that good is trending out of this very limited relationship and into other prospects. It's doesn't really leave room for that in this conception. Doesn't really imagine that that's what might happen.
Right, precisely.
Oh,
Hey,
welcome
hey,
on board.
Willful. How are you? What are you
Yeah.
thinking about?
I've come in late on the stream today, but I've seen some of the works behind the scenes that you, and I mean this in the most positive way possible, filthy, degenerate perverts have treated yourself to masochistically and having to go over this awful writing. So thank you for doing that. I wouldn't have had the guts or the heart to. In the time that I've spent in the past with you in skimming over this piece, I cannot help but go to gay signs 13, 14, and 15. They, in my mind, those 3 pages, those 3 aphorisms refute this entire piece completely. Number 14 in particular, the things people call love, on avarice, love, and friendship, I think just dumps on this entire piece of writing. I just wanted to call that out and also just say thank you for going over this.
Yeah, actually,
There-
why don't we pull
Is
that
there
up
an
briefly?
is there an excerpt specifically that we can read out?
Yeah, no, I can pull that up right here.
Wonderful.
14 is in the Kaufman edition.
I have it
What
right
is
here.
it about? A page and a bit, a page and a half, a page and 3/4. Yeah, it's not too long. It's like
It's almost 2 pages.
how it's Yeah, it's formatted by Kaufman into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs.
You know what? If that would be fun for chat, I could read out. I don't know how long.
Here, let me
you said
screen share for that.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm screen sharing it now.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I can read this out.
Yeah, I can read it as well.
Okay, awesome. Well, maybe we'll swap in. I'll swap. I'll tag you in, like a wrestling match. Okay. This is from Nietzsche's The Gay Science for the viewers out there. Aphorism number 14. The things people call love. The things people call love, avarice and love, what different feelings these two terms evoke. Nevertheless, it can be the same instinct that has two names, once deprecated by those who have, in whom the instinct has calmed down to some extent, and who are afraid for their possessions, and the other time seen from the point of view of those who are not satisfied, but still thirsty, and who therefore glorify the instinct as good. Our love of our neighbor, is it not a lust for new possessions? And likewise, our love of knowledge, of truth, and altogether any lust for what is new? Gradually, we become tired of the old, of what we safely possess, and we stretch out our hands again. Even the most beautiful scenery is no longer assured our love after we have lived in it for 3 months. And some more distant coast attracts our avarice. Possessions are generally diminished by possession. Our pleasure in ourselves tries to maintain itself by, again and again, changing something new into ourselves. That is what possession means. To become tired of some possession means tiring of ourselves. One can suffer of in excess. The lust to throw away or to distribute can also assume the honorary name of love. When we see somebody suffer, we like to exploit this opportunity to take possession of him. Those who become his benefactors and pity him, for example, do this and call the lust for a new possession that he awakens in them love. And the pleasure they feel is comparable to that aroused by the prospect of a new conquest. You can pick it up, August.
Oh yeah, Richard, I don't know if you saw my message, but are you able to share my screen to the stream? Did we lose Richard?
I'm not sure. It might take a while, so I'll just have you guys read it.
Okay. You finished off on conquest. Sexual love betrays itself most clearly as a lust for possession. The lover desires unconditional and sole possession of the person for whom he longs. He desires equally unconditional power over the soul and over the body of the beloved. He alone wants to be loved and desired to live and rule in the other soul as supreme and supremely desirable. If one considers that this means nothing less than excluding the whole world from a precious good, from happiness and enjoyment, if one considers that the lover aims at the impoverishment and deprivation of all competitors and would like to become the dragon guarding his golden hoard as the most inconsiderate and selfish of all conquerors and exploiters. If one considers finally that to the lover himself the whole rest of the world appears indifferent, pale, and worthless, and he is prepared to make any sacrifice to disturb any order, to subordinate all other interests, then one comes to feel genuine amazement that this wild avarice and injustice of sexual love has been glorified and deified so much in all ages. Indeed, that this love has furnished the concept of love as the opposite of egoism, while it actually may be the most ingenious expression of egoism. At this point, linguistic usage has evidently been formed by those who did not possess but desired. Probably, there have always been too many of these. Those to whom much possession and satiety were gained in this area have occasionally made some casual remark about the raging demon as that most gracious and beloved of all Athenians, Sophocles, did. But Eros has always laughed at such blasphemers. They were invariably his greatest favorites. Here and there on earth, we may encounter a kind of continuation of love in which this possessive craving of two people for each other gives way to a new desire and lust for possession, a shared higher thirst for an ideal above them. But who knows such love? Who has experienced it? Its right name is friendship.
Thank you for saying that, Rumple. I think the flip here is kind of obvious. That and you see this with Raz, right? Where it's like Raz
It's
can't.
interesting because this actually, I think, calls back to Aristotle's notion of friendship.
Yeah. I think it does too. Actually, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. But I think it sumo wrestles Raz into basically a kind of flipping over, where it's like, hold on. Everything that you're trying to say about the romantic, that it's precisely about the end of an egoism, is no, not really. It's actually the affirmation of one in a certain kind of way. And whatever judgment you want to place on that is whatever judgment you want to place on that. But it's in a sense quite literally running entirely contrary to the notion that one forfeits an egoism in order to engage in something like an extremely intensive, almost like storybook romantic fixation.
Yeah, and we see that precisely in the way that the ego is placed at the center of the discussion of like self-inhibition, right? It's always the centered self that is doing all of these actions, even those of self-repression. So there's not really a displacement of egoism because it's always in service of this thing that's supposed to greater the self, right?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you for sending this in, Rumple, or thank you for telling us to read this, I should say. Yeah, this is really good. And for those who are interested, this is from Nietzsche's Gay Science. Nietzsche is generally going to be really good on stuff like love. Highly recommend. In pretty much every book where it comes up, like Twilight is another good book about concerning things like love and its spiritualization and et cetera, et cetera.
That which is done out of love takes place beyond good and evil.
Exactly. By the way, we're still taking call-ins. For those who want to come in and say a couple words or say more than a couple words, if you were very affected by this article. It's in the GSL. It's going to be in the waiting room for call-in, and we'll drag you in, like we do with Obliteratus and Rumple here.
Just a summarizing remark to pass, which is this piece is effectively an asceticization of romanticism and of friendship and of desire and of love, of all of these concepts.
When you say asceticization, are you saying AES or ASCE?
ASCE.
Okay, yeah,
Ascetic, not aesthetic. Yeah.
I could see both
it's
though.
producing. It's relying on the production of a kind of
self-denial.
ascetic ideal. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Deeply. It does it through a certain aesthetics, but yes, it is ascetic.
Yeah. It's about limiting yourself in a way. Like limiting your self-fulfillment while you're in a relationship, or limiting the number of relationships that you can have, or how you engage with your children.
And you'll notice within the history of philosophy that anything that tarries with the ethical, anything that purports to tell one what to do, is of this nature of prohibition, of limitation, of imposing, imposing walls against which one must regulate and so on and so forth. It's always staked in these ways. And I think, for example, by the time we get to Nietzsche, we can kind of see that for what it is. And in fact, place it within its proper domain, right? No longer putting it outside of the landed, terrestrial, kind of embodied life of humanity, but seeing it as downstream of that life. No longer seeing the ethical as that which stands above and must regulate the material, but that which is consequent of a certain kind of, well, a certain type of life, as Nietzsche would say, a certain type of life.
Precisely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would like to also point those interested in this aphorism to read the preceding one and the one immediately after. The preceding one is on the doctrine of the feeling of power, and it is probably the first elucidation of the will to power, as it's kind of called in the gay science, and right early on in his corpus. I think it's as with all of this aphorisms, very intentionally placed, right? Like we're building on the doctrine of the feeling of power into that feeling of power manifesting itself to take sole possession of others, love, avarice, this whole idea of possession. And then 14 ends on the idea that in his mind, no, true love is in fact friendship. And then we get from a distance, which is 15. And I want to read one short paragraph, one of my favorite paragraphs in one of my favorite books by Vanessa Lem. We are on page 82. It's a very short paragraph. And she's in the middle of a chapter speaking about giving and forgiving, friendship and justice. And she has this paragraph to say about Nietzsche and friendship. I'm quoting Lem here. Friendship is a relationship that does not make singularities common to each other. What friends have in common is what distinguishes them. What they share is what cannot be shared. Friendship stands for the love of the other, where the love does not lead to the fusion and confusion of me with you. Friendship protects the plurality of the friends by affirming that the respective ways of the two singularities are irreducibly distinct. Friends are against each other, which literally means to be at the same time closest, gegen, and furthest apart, gegen, from one another. The German word gegen here, it has a double meaning, which is beautifully used by Nietzsche in this respect. Continuing, friendship overcomes difference and distance while at the same time preserving it. Accordingly, what reveals the friends' affinity and relatedness to each other is not the way that they approach each other, but the way they part from each other.
Yeah, you could almost say that in Nietzsche's view, Raz is the gluttonous one here, the excessive.
Correct. Yep.
Could see that, yeah. What exactly isn't gluttonous about demanding all of somebody's time and
Devotion.
energy?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that, that's a wonderful irony to end on, I think. And that's the great irony about all of this, is that finally this kind of need for complete devotion is entirely gluttonous. And in fact, this entire kind of ascetic, and there's always something gluttonous about asceticism, to go back to Rumpel's point about the kind of asceticism that's at work in this article. One never just is ascetic. This is another thing that Nietzsche was wonderfully understood, great on in the Twilight of the Idols, when he speaks on monks. He speaks on monastic life. Specifically, he speaks on an order of French monks known as, I think, Trappists. I don't know what that would be in French, but they're called Trappists. Trappists. And what he says about them is, in order for you to be so ascetic, you actually, in a sense, have to be the most quote unquote degenerate. In this case, meaning dissolute, the most, in a sense, sensual, because you have to regulate yourself so distinctly, so harshly, so incredibly. And so, in fact, Nietzsche says, really, the biggest dissolutes are those who are in the monastery. Apparently, okay, thank you. August is telling me that le trappe is how you would say it in French. But so Nietzsche's point here is, in fact, that it's always the gluttons who, in a sense, have to kind of throw away gluttony entirely. By the way, if you've ever been addicted to anything, you understand this. This immediately makes sense, right? Like, you have to quit completely. There's no moderation for someone who actually has an addictive relationship to anything. And so there's a way in which,
I mean,
you
that's
know,
one of the things like Alcoholics
Yeah.
Anonymous, which operates on a very Christian ascetic mode, right? Where they, the idea of like once an addict, always an addict, but also that because you're always an addict, that you can never actually consume the thing that you were addicted to again in moderation, because that's indulging in addiction, no matter what happens between now and then, right?
The whole modern concept of
absolutely.
addiction is very short in its history. It's only
Yeah.
a couple of 100 years, and it's deeply ascetic.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It would be nice to find new ways to deal with something like relations that are diminishing and that feel compulsory than just this kind of the way we think of it now. But I will also say that but yeah, I mean to both of your points, like there is a great affinity between absolute self-abnegation and a kind of absolute what usually tend to call, for example, in psychoanalysis, desublimation. So if you repress desires by sublimating them, by redirecting them into things that are not precisely that indulgence, into, for example, community life, into some other quote unquote productive thing, then, and if that's sublimation, then desublimation is this kind of wanton, complete indulgence in the thing that you're supposed to be repressing. And there's always an affinity between the two. There's always a link. And this is the great. I mean, you even see this. You know, I don't. Maybe some people can speak to this in the comments, but you'll often find in very kind of niche, like fringe, like BDSM communities, people who have a lot of like religious trauma and an upbringing wherein sexual gratification was like entirely verboten and entirely like denied as a possibility for them. Like the really, this is kind of my kind of experience, but you really do
So you're
see.
doing Freud's Return of the Repressed, right?
Yeah, no, yeah, it really is a return of the repressed in the deepest way. Absolutely, I see so many people who are kind of like lapsed Christians, in those communities, kind of partaking in everything. Yeah.
I think another thing is that, like mainstream communities, as opposed to alternative sexual spaces, won't teach you how to accept yourself and your sexuality. Like, there's a reason that BDSM is healing, and it's because it's such a like structured communal environment.
All right. I mean, I feel like we've pretty much covered what we need to at the moment of section 1. How's everyone feeling?
Good. I was actually just about to ask if we were ready to wrap things up as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
Sleepy,
Yeah.
sleepy, but very satisfied. Yeah.
Sleepy but very satisfied. Wonderful. I guess I'll wrap it up. This is section 1 of Baz's article on Substack, titled "I Lust, Therefore I Am: The Ethics of Desire." Subheading: A Philosophy of Sexual Discipline, Loyalty, and the Self. Thank you for everyone who attended this. Thank you, Sunday, for rating into us. We're gonna pick up. When are we picking up section 2, y'all?
Good
Perhaps
question.
Friday?
I think Friday. Yeah.
Okay,
Or
well,
Thursday.
Friday.
Because Sunday's streaming every day this week.
I
Could be
see.
earlier than
I see. We'll make an announcement. We'll make an announcement in the GSL for when we're picking it back up. It'll probably be whenever it is. It'll probably be at the same time that we started today. But yeah, thank you everyone for stopping in.
Have a good rest of your night, and we'll see you again whenever we see you. Thanks for coming.
Bye.